Hey, and what's going up, guys? Welcome to an episode of Intermission. This is what I usually do in between Tales from the Stash or Workbench Journal, and figured talk about this a little bit. So, as some of you guys know, I'm working on the Monogram 148 scale F106 Delta Dart kit, and it's an old kit, but it's a really nice kit. And I started thinking about what's been happening over the years with Revell-Monogram, because it's changed hands quite a bit. And I was running through the news finding out about Habico. They were the recent owners of Revell-Monogram USA, and they also own Revell Germany. And for some of you guys who stumble across this channel, I recommend Googling about Habico and the bankruptcy and everything, but some of you modelers who do watch this, I'll explain a little bit what's been happening lately. Recently, Habico filed for bankruptcy, and they ended up selling off their assets, and they're basically no more. And they used to be they weren't just plastic model kits. They also had Tower Hobbies. They distributed Hasegawa, or imported it from Japan. They also handled RC cars. They handled model rockets. You name it, they did it. Basically, they were a hobby company. And unfortunately, they ceased to exist, which put Revell-Monogram USA in limbo. Now, Revell Germany, even though they share the name with Revell, they're basically a separate entity, and they're still going. So, they were picked up by an investment firm. I don't know what's going on now. I don't know what's going to happen with the old Monogram molds. I don't even know what's going to happen with the old Revell molds, or Redwall, or even any of the molds for that matter, or even the company in general. I don't know if what's going on, but it kind of worries me, because I grew up building a lot of the old Revell-Monogram kits. This is what I do know. I'll try to give a brief history here. I might be wrong in a lot of aspects, but from my understanding, Monogram used to be owned by Mattel. Then they got picked up by the Odyssey Group. I don't know what that was about. They merged or picked up Revell, USA, one of the two, during the mid-'80s, because I remember seeing on the instructions, on the kits, Revell-Monogram, which was, even though they were two separate houses, they were still one company. And then Hallmark Cards, which also owns Binney & Smith. Binney & Smith is kind of familiar with you guys. They run the Crayola products. Matter of fact, Crayola, as far as I know, their products are still in Pennsylvania. That's not far off from where I live. So they had them for a while, as well as Revell Germany. And then Habico picked them up in the mid-2000s, and now we're at where we're at. So I don't know what's going on, but I do have a very fond memory of Monogram kits as a kid. Watched my uncle build them, so I'm very familiar with Monogram. I'm very familiar with Revell. I didn't know much about them until I read up more and more about them, especially the introduction of the internet. And it turns out it was a long storied history, and I didn't realize how important they were, being a model builder myself. But I can tell you this, it's going to get very interesting, and hopefully I don't start, when I'm going to find an old Monogram kit, or an old Revell for that matter, I don't get into bidding wars over on eBay, or get gouged at swap meets or something if I want to find something like that. But let's see what happens. But I can tell you this from Monogram. Monogram was actually one of the better companies during the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. 90s, they tried to still maintain relevancy, but they were up against competition like Hasegawa, Tamiya, Edward, Italeri, SE Airfix. You know, but plastic model building in the United States started with Revell-Monogram, Hawk, a few others, but Monogram was one of the standouts. And the reason why I remember them finally, because they were easy to acquire. I was able, and when I started getting into the hobby, I cut my teeth and I started building Monogram kits most of the time, especially when I forayed into 148 scale models, because they didn't have that many in 72nd, but they had a lot in 48, and they had quite a few model car kits. I tried building a couple of them, but for some reason my interest would go at a certain point and they'd just fall off a cliff. But the kits weren't bad, especially some of the old Revell car kits. But I remember Monogram fondly because military model building was one of my things, and Monogram was one of them. I actually learned how to be a modeler because of their kits. They weren't the best in the world. I mean, but at that time when they came out, they were very good. The detail was very good. Yeah, they had the drawbacks. The fit wasn't that great until later in the last half of the 20th century, last decade. They started getting better drastically with the Pro Modeler line and other things, but a lot of their older kits is where I started building. Mostly Cold War era subjects, but sometimes I got into World War II. And like I said, the kits, they require a little bit of work, filling, sanding, test fitting, patience, but they also require a lot of painting because of the detail, and they're also cheap. You know, I was able to go to a local toy store or a craft store to go pick up most of the kits I wanted to build. But if I wanted more than just what they had on the shelves at those, I had to go to a hobby shop, and they had tons of Monogram and Revell kits all over the place. And I just remember finally, because my first Monogram kit was a 1/72nd scale F4 Phantom kit, which is basically a shrunken down version of a 148 kit, which I got to build later in the mid-90s, which was a great kit. This was the Air Force version, not the Navy version. There was also the P-47 Bubble Top. I remember the Typhoon fondly. I actually won a model contest with one of Revell-Monogram's kits, the PBY-5 Catalina. Wasn't the best kit in the world, but to me it was a game changer, because that's where I started steering away from just building them and putting them onto a shelf to building them and actually improving my skills, where that was the game changer. Like, I started doing the research, I started making them look more realistic. That's where it started for me. And like I said, they were cheap, they were easy to get. Not so much anymore. But I remember fondly, and I actually won a few modeling contests with a lot of old Monogram kits. And a bunch of them are still my favorites, like their F-14 kit, Tomcat kit. I built their A kit before they retooled it into a D. I've also built their F-20 Target Shark kit, which actually wasn't bad. A little rough. That was difficult to put together. Some of the kits were awful. I remember the 1/72nd scale A-10 Warthog. I'm surprised anybody could build that. That was just, it was just almost unbuildable. A lot of putty work involved, but the detail was good and it was there. It was the same thing with the rest of their kits, especially into the late 70s, well into the 80s and 90s. Their kits were great, and they were good alternatives. And the biggest reason why I bought them is because, Hoscow was still out of my price range in my teens. That's when I really started building. I still remember the first time my uncle picked up one of the Monogram kits he was building. I think it was an F-14, or was it an F-1? It was the F-106, and it was that was the first time I've ever seen the box art of a Monogram kit, and I was just enamored by it. It was just wow. And I started watching my uncle build this, and that's what really started getting me into it. I mean, my uncle tried, when I was younger, tried to get me into model kits. Picked up a couple snap-togethers from Monogram, which also helped greatly, which really put the ball in play. Actually, he was the one who really started it. But I really didn't commit until 14, 15 years old. And like I say, over the years, I just started, it became a staple of mine. Whatever money I had from like side job or summer job or a part-time job, whatever money I had, I would go get paints, and then I would annoy my uncle, take me to the op shop to get the colors I needed, then go find a Monogram kit, and just put it together and put it up on the shelf. And there's other things about the Monogram kits that really brought memories back. It's a shame, because who knows if they're going to be around. Now I'm just going to go out on a limb here, but I'm hoping if Revell Germany does have all the molds and stuff, they'll try to reopen like a distribution in the United States and distribute some of their kits from Germany into the States here. Or I'm hoping if they end up selling off the molds, that some other upstart company will get a hold of them, and I'm hoping that they won't be jacked up where prices where you got to fight for in limited batches. That's what I'm hoping they don't do. And of course, I'm really reaching here. I'm hoping to retool the old molds, because they're still not bad. The detail's great. It's a little dated. You know, it's unlike what we prefer now, which is scribed panel lines. A lot of it was raised detail, raised panel lines. But as for the rest of the detail, it was the best bang for the buck. It really was when it came to the monogram. And some of Revell's kits, I still remember some of Revell's old kits fondly. And they weren't the most accurate kits, but they still reissued them from time to time, and they were worth building. It was more nostalgic, and the fact that Monogram actually did some subjects that other companies really didn't touch. For example, the Century series. A couple companies had put out some aircraft in the Century series. Trumpeter put out in 148 the F-106 kit, which I got on my shelf. They also put out an F-100. From what I understand, it's an okay kit. It's not a great kit, but it's still a little better than Monogram. But Monogram was still the bar that was set. Kitty Hawk put out an F-101 Voodoo. That was a 2-seat was put out by Monogram. There was a conversion kit from Coster. Actually, we were able to turn it into a single-seat version, which was really, really cool. You also had the F-102 Delta Dagger. You have the Starfighter kit, which the Monogram had released a few times, both as the International G version or the F-104C, which can easily be converted back into an A, which didn't require much. And they also did the F-105 Thunder Chief, which is probably still better than the Hobbit Boss kit. I mean, yeah, Trumpeter had one in 132nd, but Hobbit Boss screwed the pooch on this one, and the Monogram kit is just still better. Not so much because of shapes, it's because for the money. The D was not that great, but it was good, but it wasn't great. You still had to fix the nose. But even then, it didn't require much. The rest of the kit was just fine. And granted, it's not as heavily loaded with detail like the Hobbit Boss was, but it was still a little bit easier to build and more sturdier. So that made life a lot easier. The Century series won't be. It's granted, Trumpeter made better kits. Hasegawa made a better F-104 Starfighter. I keep hearing, maybe I'm wrong, AMK is supposed to be putting out an all-new F-106 kit, but Monogram was the bar Monogram set the bar for many years. Their F-4 Phantom kit was really, really good until Hasegawa came in with their competition with the F-4C and D. Monogram came out with a J. Wasn't that great, but it was an easy fix. Had a couple of inaccuracies, but it was an easy fix, especially for the money, and there were plenty of aftermarket companies out there that could easily correct it. Till then, it's Monogram, and then Academy and Zakai Mura came out with better Phantom kits. You also had, like you said, their car kits. There was a lot of them, ranging from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s. They had some wonderful kits from that time frame. And like you said, Revell had they went big on this one. Their 148 scale B-1 bomber, that thing was enormous. I mean, it was a big, big kit. I think it was about the size of the table next to me. I could be wrong, but you don't think so? Try to pick up that box. Get that box, see how big it is. That's a big step. But also, Monogram was well known for doing big kits. B-17, B-24, the B-29. They did a B-52 on 72nd scale. They were from the late 60s, early 70s. Wasn't the best kit in the world, but it was a great kit, for that time frame. And when they first released it, they actually had something where it had a jet engine sound. They did away with it in subsequent releases, but it's still around. They also did a P-61 Black Widow, which I built. Not an easy kit to build. A4 Skyhawk. I mean, they weren't just limited to just Cold War and World War II. They were pretty bold and daring, and a lot of their kits were actually pretty decent until they had competition. But Revell-Monogram were, overall, they were. And I just remember them very well because they were fun to build. They also did subjects nobody touched. Like the one variant of the A4 Skyhawk, the OA4M. Nobody else has done it since. Nobody else has. I mean, everybody keeps hoping Hasegawa will, because they put out an all-new A4 Skyhawk line. Like during the mid-2000s, they went from the B to all the way to the M, but they never put out the OA4M. Matter of fact, when they did release it, it was the old Monogram kit. I don't know where the molds are now. Hopefully Revell Germany has them. Accurate Miniatures had a couple of Monogram's old 1/72nd scale kits, molds. Don't know where they are now. Hopefully, like I said, hopefully somebody else, hopefully Revell Germany got a hold of them. And it's just a shame because it isn't just a piece of my youth. It's a piece of everybody's youth that grew up building their kits, and no one knows where they are now. Matter of fact, Monogram actually, they tried their hand at armor, but they did in 1/32nd scale. Just unfortunately, 1/35th scale took off as compared to 1/32nd. So it's kind of a shame, but it would have been interesting to see that. They were one of the ones that came out with an all-new A6 Intruder kit at that time during the late 80s. It was under the Revell boxing, but it was still done by the Monogram engineering crew. And, up until that point, it was the Fujimi kit, which was okay, but it wasn't that great. Monogram came along with that. Or Revell-Monogram came along with that, and, for many years, it was the kit, and it wasn't released as much as their other ones were, which was a shame. Now, you got Kinetic, you got Hobby Boss, the Monogram kit's starting to be ignored, which is, you shouldn't. It's still easier to pick up, still easier to put together. It may take time, but it's worth it. But still, they were ideal beginner's kits because you learn how to build. You actually learned how to build a mono kit with them. And it's a shame that they're gone now. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully they'll come back. Hopefully another company will pick them up. I just hope they don't end up being nostalgic, like a one-time thing like Round 2 Models does with, or Cult TV Man does with some of the old kits, like old AMT or old NPC. They just release them for a little while and then just, that's the end of it. I'm just hoping they don't do that because they're worth it, and it's a shame if they cease to exist because that means I'm getting old. I'm really real old. So this is it for now. I'm upstairs because it's hot. It's summertime, and right now outside it's almost 100 degrees. But to be fair, it's summer, and being where I grow up, being where I am in the state of New Jersey, you get all 4 seasons. And unfortunately, I always make the joke of during the wintertime, sometimes it gets like Germany in the state of New Jersey. During the summer, sometimes it gets hot like Cambodia during the summer. And it gets just as humid. But to be fair, it is the Northeast region. That's how it goes. So, this is it for now. Sorry about the rambling. Happy modeling. Take it easy, guys. And hopefully I'll talk to you guys again soon. Have fun.